The morning I finally understood what had kept my bees alive, I was standing in 8 inches of snow at 20 minutes before sunrise, wearing Della's old canvas barn coat because I hadn't been able to find mine in the dark, and I was not breathing. Not because of the cold, though 11 degrees is cold enough to make your nose seize and your eyes water before you've taken 3 steps off the porch. I wasn't breathing because there was something at the far end of my apiary, something large and dark and very still, standing at the base of hive number 9 as carefully as a man might stand beside a hospital bed. And Mac was sitting in the snow 6 feet to my left, with his ears up and his tail flat, and his whole body pointed at it, not making a sound. I had kept bees for 22 years. I knew what belonged in that field at dawn in November. Nothing I knew had a shape like that. If you found yourself watching this kind of story late at night, I'd ask you to leave a comment and tell me you were here. It helps more than you might think. But I need to go back, because without what came before, that morning at the hives means nothing except a frightened man in a dead woman's coat. Della died the second week of April, 18 months before that morning in the snow. It was fast, the way a fast illness is fast, which means it was not fast at all, but felt that way after, when you try to make sense of the 6 weeks between the diagnosis and the end of it. She'd been a healthy woman. She gardened, she walked the ridge road every evening from May through October. She brought me tea in the apiary without being asked because she liked the smell of warm wax and propolis on a summer afternoon. She was 54 years old, and then she wasn't anything at all. We had 31 acres in the Klamath foothills, Northern California, high enough that winter comes in earnest and stays past its welcome. The house sat in a clearing that Della had kept up with something close to devotion. Flower beds along the south wall, a kitchen garden inside a wire fence that the deer tested annually and lost annually, a big cedar near the apiary fence line that had been there longer than either of us could account for. She used to leave a small dish of honeycomb at the base of that cedar, not for any reason she could explain when I asked. She said it felt right, leaving something at the oldest living thing on the property. I told her the coyotes would eat it, and she said that was fine too. So I stopped asking. The apiary held 14 hives. I'd built the yard over 15 years, starting with 2 nucleus colonies from a man down in Eureka who smoked hand-rolled cigarettes and could identify a queen by her movement alone. I'd lost hives to mites, to small hive beetles, to 2 winters that came in below 0 for a week straight, to 1 summer when the blackberries failed across the whole ridge and I fed sugar syrup until I ran out of jars. But I'd also learned, and by the time Della got sick, the yard was in good shape, the colonies strong, the genetics rotated carefully, the varroa load manageable. What I had not learned to account for was the first winter without her. I went through the motions. I wrapped the hives in tar paper the 3rd week of October, same as always. I checked the mouse guards, reduced the entrances, stacked pine duff around the bases to break the wind. I put on the candy boards in early November, leaving enough ventilation to let the moisture out. I did everything I had always done, everything the books said and the old-timers said, and my own 22 years said. The hives went into winter, lean and ready, and I went into winter something I didn't have a precise word for. Not ready, hollowed out. Operating on the instructions I'd left myself back when operating was easier. Mac was 7 years old that first winter, a border collie with 1 brown eye and 1 eye that was half blue, half brown, a colour nobody could quite describe that turned out different in different light. He'd been Della's dog first, or thought he had been, which for a border collie is the same thing. After she was gone, he redistributed his affections to me in that particular way that dogs have of deciding you are now their primary project. He slept under the foot of my bed. He followed me to the apiary in the morning, and back to the house at night. He was not demonstrative about it. He simply did not leave. That first winter, the hives came through. All 14, which I had not expected. February had been brutal. 2 weeks in the low teens, a wind off the ridge that found every gap in the insulation. I'd checked them in early March with the dread I'd developed a habit of, already calculating which colonies I'd need to replace, already thinking about where I could source nucleus colonies on short notice. All 14 had survived. I told myself I'd finally gotten the preparation right. I told myself this with a conviction that felt almost like the old pride, the kind that means something. I planted in spring. I kept the bees. I put a dish of honeycomb at the base of the cedar because it was April, and that was when Della had always started, and I found I could not stop the ritual without it feeling like an additional subtraction. The dish stayed out through the summer, refilled every 2 weeks, and I did not look too carefully at whether anything had eaten from it between refills. Owen called in July the first year. We talked for 11 minutes. He was living in Denver, working for an engineering firm that built water treatment infrastructure. He had Della's precision with numbers and my talent for silence, which was not a good combination for a phone call between grieving people. We talked around the edges of everything that mattered and said goodbye, without having said anything much. I understood in a way I couldn't articulate at the time that the call had been an attempt. I also understood that I had been too far inside my own sealed-up grief to meet it properly. He didn't call again that summer. The second winter was the same as the first. I prepped the hives the same way, same materials, same timing. February came in cold and stayed. All 14 colonies came through. I told myself the same thing I'd told myself the year before, only with slightly less conviction this time. 2 winters was a good run. There was no reason to read anything else into it. Mac had started sitting at the apiary fence at dusk that second winter, which I noticed. He wasn't fence-watching dogs are prone to. Nothing in his body suggested agitation. He sat the way dogs sit when they have decided something bears watching, and they are prepared to watch it indefinitely. His ears would come up and his head would tilt east toward the tree line, and he'd hold there until full dark, then trot back to the porch and wait for me to let him in. I thought he was tracking a deer or catching the scent of something moving through the cedars beyond the fence line. I did not think about it more than that. November of the second year, I had my second conversation with Owen. It lasted 8 minutes. The tone was careful, the way a handshake is careful between 2 men who know they are not sure yet whether to trust each other. He asked about the bees. I told him all 14 had come through last winter. He said that was good. I said yes. We talked about the weather in Denver, which was something to talk about that cost nothing. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while with the phone on the table in front of me, not going anywhere. The kitchen felt too large. It had felt too large since the second week of April the previous year, and 18 months of mornings and evenings in it had not changed that. I still only set 1 cup on the counter in the morning. I had stopped leaving the radio on because the silence felt more honest than the noise. Now, I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened that 3rd November. I am not a person who makes things up. I kept bees for 22 years. Before that, I spent 12 years as a field technician for a power company, running line through terrain that would ruin your day if you thought about it too carefully. I have been careful with the truth my whole adult life, because inaccuracy in my former work had consequences measured in voltage, and because Della was the kind of woman who could hear a hedge from 2 counties away. What I am about to describe is what I saw. I am not embroidering it. I am not softening the parts that make me sound like a man who has lost his footing on what's real. 3rd week of November. First hard freeze of the season, down to 11 degrees overnight. A number I know because I have a thermometer on the cedar post at the northeast corner of the apiary, and I read it every morning. I came out at first light, Mac at my hip, expecting to see what I always saw. 14 hives standing in their rows, the tar paper wrappings a little battered by wind. The snow settled flat around the bases the way snow settles when nothing has moved through it. The snow around the bases was not flat. It was packed, not disturbed the way deer disturbed snow is disturbed, not the chaotic scatter of something sniffing or pawing. Packed in deliberate arcs like someone had gone around each hive base and pressed the snow down firmly and evenly, sealing the gap between the bottom board and the ground, and pushed into those packed arcs along the north and east faces of each hive. Pine duff. A lot of it. Gathered from somewhere and placed with enough intention that it was sitting in consistent thickness all the way around the insulated base. Adding another layer of windbreak that I had not put there. I stood and looked at this for a long time. My first thought was that a neighbor had come onto the property in the night and done some kind of goodwill gesture without telling me, which made no sense but which I tried to believe for about 90 seconds. Nobody I knew would come onto a man's land in the dark and rearrange his apiary equipment without leaving a note or a footprint I could identify. The prints in the snow were large, very large, larger than any boot I'd seen. Not a boot shape either. My second thought was that something in the snow's weight distribution had done this, that the overnight freeze had compressed the drifts in a pattern that mimicked intention. I walked the whole yard twice, looking at each hive in order, and I dismissed this explanation by the fourth hive, because the pine duff had to have come from somewhere, and the nearest dense accumulation of it was at the tree line, 40 feet beyond the fence. Snow compression does not carry pine duff from a tree line and arrange it around 14 hive bases in consistent layers. My third explanation, the one I held onto for 2 days, was an animal, something large enough to leave those prints, intelligent enough to move slowly and carefully between the hives without disturbing them. I thought about bears, which do move through this country, and I thought about the specific behavior of bears in relation to beehives, which is not gentle and not organized. A bear at a beehive is a catastrophe. What I was looking at was not a catastrophe. It was tidy. By the end of those 2 days, I had stopped explaining. Mac's behavior at the fence had changed. He was no longer sitting there for an hour at dusk and then coming in. He was sitting there all evening, from the time I finished supper until I went out to bring him in at 9 o'clock. And he was not sitting tense, not trembling the way a dog trembles when it smells something it considers dangerous. He was sitting with a kind of patient attention, the way he used to sit when Della was working in the garden, and he was keeping her company without intruding. Alert, calm, present. I started watching too. Not from the fence at first, from the kitchen window after I'd turned the light off so nothing could see me looking. The cedars beyond the property line make a dark wall at that time of year, nothing behind them readable in the dark. And for 3 evenings, I saw nothing. I told myself this was because there was nothing to see. I almost believed it. The 4th evening, something moved along the tree line. Not through it. Along it, parallel to the fence, moving east to west at a distance I estimated at 70 feet from where I stood. The light was gone, but not entirely gone. That last grey in a November sky that is less light than the absence of full dark, and what I saw was large. The word large does not quite cover it. It moved with a kind of unhurried deliberateness, like something that had lived in that country long enough to know it didn't need to hurry. It was upright, not entirely consistent with upright in the way a man is upright, but upright enough that I stood at the window and felt the hair on the back of my neck come up and stay up. Mac saw it too. His ears tracked it the full length of the fence line, east to west, and when it passed out of sight into the cedars, he held his position for another minute, and then let out one long, slow breath through his nose and relaxed. He did not bark. He didn't make any sound at all. He settled the way you settle when something you've been watching has behaved exactly the way you expected it to behave, and there is nothing left to be concerned about. I was not as settled as Mac. I went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink. And I thought about what I had seen for about an hour. And I thought about the pine duff at the hive bases. And I thought about 2 winters of complete colony survival in conditions that should have taken at least 2 or 3 hives each time. And I thought about something an old man in Eureka had told me years before when I'd gone to buy my second set of nucleus colonies. He'd said that the hill country up here had a way of deciding what it paid attention to. I'd taken it for the kind of thing old men in beekeeping say. I hadn't filed it anywhere useful. I filed it now. 4 days before the full encounter, I found a second batch of pine duff at the hive bases. This one was larger than the first, the duff packed tighter, and there was new snow that had fallen overnight, and the snow around each hive base was again pressed firm and even. I measured one of the prints in the fresh snow with the tape measure I kept in my coat pocket for checking queen cell spacing. 17 inches long, 7 inches across at the widest point. I measured it 3 times. I wrote the number in the small notebook I kept for hive records because I did not want to misremember it. That morning, Mac walked the full length of the apiary fence on his own, nose down, moving slowly, and at the east corner he stopped and sat and looked into the cedars for a long time. Then he walked back to me and pressed his flank against my leg and stood there. I reached down and put my hand on his head, and we stayed like that for a minute. I had no adequate category for what was happening. That was the uncomfortable truth of it. I was a man who had spent his adult life working in a world where things had explanations, where a failing colony had a root cause you could find if you looked carefully enough, where a deadline had a breakpoint somewhere along its length. I knew how to find the thing that was wrong, and I knew how to name it. What was happening at my apiary did not give me any of those familiar handholds. It was not wrong. It was, by every measure I could apply, helpful, and the help was specific and deliberate and scaled to exactly what my hives needed in that weather, which meant that whatever was providing it understood something about what my hives needed. That thought was harder to hold than any of the others. The morning of the full encounter arrived the way November mornings arrive in the foothills, with a pale greenish light that has no warmth in it and a cold that grips the lungs before you've made it off the porch step. I'd woken at 4:30, not from any noise or alarm, just from the particular restlessness that had lived in my chest since the previous July, when I'd sat with the phone on the kitchen table after hanging up with Owen and felt the distance between us as something physical, like a weight in the air. I'd lain there until 5, when the light was beginning to change at the edges of the window frame, and then I'd gotten up and put on 2 layers and Della's canvas barn coat because I couldn't find mine in the dark of the closet, and I didn't want to turn the light on for reasons I can't entirely explain. Mac was already at the door. He didn't press against me or whine the way he whined when he needed to go out. He was standing at the door the way he stood when he had decided something was happening, and he intended to be part of it. I opened the door, and we went out. The snow was deep enough to come over the top of my boots if I wasn't careful, and the air was still, the kind of still that happens when the temperature has dropped the last few degrees, and the world is holding its breath. I could see the apiary clearly in the pre-dawn light, the white hives in their rows, the cedar standing dark against the pale sky. And at the far end of the row, at hive number 9, something was crouched. Crouched is not precisely the right word. It was lowered the way something large lowers itself to work at ground level, the way you lower yourself when you're checking a bottom board, getting your hands close to the thing you're looking at. It was dark against the snow, an enormous dark, and it was moving its hands, or what I understood to be its hands, at the base of the hive, pressing snow, packing it firm, and even around the edges of the wrapped base, exactly the way I had been finding it done each morning, moving slowly enough that the hives didn't register the presence, careful enough that I could hear nothing from the colonies through the cold air. I didn't move. My body had made that decision before my mind was involved in it. Mac sat down in the snow beside me. That was all. He sat down and held still, and we both watched. The creature was working Hive 9. Then it straightened, if straightening is the word for something that size, returning to its full height, and moved to Hive 10. The movement was unhurried. It had no quality of alarm in it, no quality of secrecy either. It moved the way something moves when it is engaged in a task it has done many times before and sees no reason to do differently. At Hive 10 it lowered itself again, the pine duff already gathered and placed in the snow nearby, and began working the base with the same methodical care. At some point in this, it became aware that I was there. I don't know how. I hadn't moved. The wind, what little there was coming from the north, not carrying my scent toward the hives. Maybe it was Mac, or the absence of Mac's usual movement. Whatever it was, the creature stopped what it was doing, very slowly, and turned and looked at me. I have been trying to describe that look for 18 months, and I have not found a way to do it justice without sounding like a man describing something he only half saw. I will say this. It was not the look of an animal caught doing something it shouldn't. There was no startle in it, no threat in it. It was the look of something that had known I was there and had been deciding in its own time whether to acknowledge it. The eyes were dark, darker than the face around them, and they held on me for long enough that I felt the back of my coat get cold from standing still. And then it looked down at the hive it had been working. Then it looked back at me. The cold in that air was so complete that I could see my own breath and Mac's breath rising in small pale clouds, and the creature's breath too. A larger exhalation, steady and slow, just visible in the cold. It finished packing the snow at the base of Hive 10. Not quickly, not hurriedly. It worked the rest of that base with the same deliberate care it had been using when I'd arrived. The pine duff pressed into position, the snow sealed around it. When it was done, it held still again, and I understood in that stillness, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the evidence of 3 winters, that this was not the first time, that this had been happening every November, every hard freeze, every night that the temperature dropped below what my wrappings alone could reliably hold, that the 14 hives had come through not on my preparation alone, but because something in those cedars had been adding to what I did, quietly, without asking for acknowledgement, without disturbing anything I'd left in place. Della's dish was on the cedar stump. I'd filled it 2 weeks before, a section of capped comb from the late-season harvest, dark amber, the way Klamath buckwheat honey colours when it sets. The dish was empty. The creature looked at the cedar for a moment. I couldn't read that look. I didn't try. Then it turned east and moved back toward the tree line, unhurried, the snow barely registering the depth of those steps. And in 30 seconds, the cedars had closed around it, and there was nothing at the end of my apiary except 14 hives in their rows, and the packed snow at each base, and the silence that comes after something large has left a space. Mac stayed sitting for another minute. Then he stood up and shook the snow off his coat and looked at me, and we walked back to the house. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I didn't make coffee. I sat there with Della's coat still on and Mac lying on my feet under the table, and the morning coming in at the window the way mornings come in when you've been awake long enough to meet them, grey first, and then slowly, reluctantly, something closer to gold. There was a thing I had been carrying for 18 months that I had no word for. It was not just grief, though grief was in it. It was the feeling that the house, the land, the apiary, the daily round of work I moved through, all of it had become a kind of waiting room, a place I was in between something that had ended and something I could not see coming. I had kept going because the hives needed keeping, because the property needed maintaining, because Mac needed feeding. The reasons were sufficient, and they were not enough. I had stopped being in my life and started being adjacent to it, which is a slow way to disappear that doesn't feel like disappearing from the inside. What I felt sitting at that table was not a dramatic shift. It was more like a long-held pressure releasing very slightly, the way a lid you've been keeping tight gives a quarter turn. Something in the clarity of what I had just seen, something in the plain factual evidence that something had been paying attention to what I was doing, and adding to it in the specific ways it needed adding to, had gotten under the sealed feeling and loosened it. I thought about Della leaving the dish at the cedar. I thought about her saying it felt right to leave something at the oldest living thing on the property. I thought about 18 months of refilling that dish out of a habit I couldn't explain to myself and had never fully explained to her. I thought about 14 hives alive in their rows in the snow. Then I picked up the phone and called Owen. It rang 4 times and I was composing myself to leave a message when he picked up. He said hello twice before I said anything, and what I said was not what I'd planned to say, because I hadn't planned to say anything in particular. I said, "I need to tell you something that happened this morning." He was quiet for a second. "Dad, are you all right?" "I'm fine. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. I want to tell you something." So I told him. Not well, not in the careful, organized way I'd have told it if I'd rehearsed. I told it the way you tell something you've just come from, the edges still warm on it, the details not sorted yet into which ones matter and which ones are just background. I told him about the snow at the hive bases, about the pine duff, about Mac at the fence, about the prints I'd measured 3 times and written down. I told him about the morning, about what I'd seen at Hive 9 and 10 in the pre-dawn light. I told him about the look. He listened through all of it without interrupting, which is not something Owen usually managed. When I was done, there was a long pause. "Dad," he said, and then didn't say anything else for a moment. "I believe you." I had not known until he said it that I'd needed someone to say it. We talked for another 40 minutes. Not about the creature mostly. About his mother, which we had not done, not really, in 18 months of careful 10-minute phone calls. He told me about a morning in late April, 2 weeks after she'd died, when he'd driven to the nearest open country he could find outside Denver and sat on the hood of his car for 2 hours because he hadn't known what else to do with the size of it. I told him about the kitchen feeling too large. He said he knew what I meant by that. I told him I had been sorry for the past 1.5 years, that we hadn't found a better way to be in it together. He said he had been sorry too. Neither of us said it very cleanly. It came out in pieces, the way these things do between people who are not practiced at saying them. Before we hung up, he said he was thinking about coming out in the spring. I said that sounded good. I meant it. April came in warm that year, the snowpack running off fast, and the first bloom arriving by mid-month. The phacelia along the south edge of the property opened before I expected it, and the bees were out in numbers by the second week, the hives humming in a register that beekeepers learn to read the way a mechanic reads an engine, the particular frequency that means a colony is strong and working and not under stress. All 14 hives. The same 14 that had come through the winter, and the winter before that, and the winter before that. Owen drove out from Denver in his own truck, which I had not expected. I'd thought he might fly. He pulled into the yard on a Thursday afternoon with a bag that looked like it was packed for a week, and we stood in the driveway for a moment doing what men in my family tend to do, which is stand close to each other and not say very much, and hope the proximity carries what the words won't. Then I brought him inside and made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, the one that had felt too large for 18 months, and it felt a little less large. He stayed for 5 days. We walked the property. We worked on the apiary fence, the north section of which needed new posts, and we did the work the way you do physical work, with someone you're finding your way back to, quietly, efficiently, with occasional exchanges about the post depth or the staple spacing, and occasional longer pauses that weren't uncomfortable the way they used to be. On the third day, he asked me to show him where I'd seen the prints in the snow. I took him to Hive 9 and stood in the place I'd been standing and described what I'd seen. He listened. He looked at the hive, at the cedar, at the tree line, and he didn't say anything skeptical, and he didn't say anything credulous either. He just looked. That was enough. On the last morning of his visit, he came out to the apiary with me while I did my inspection rounds. He held the hive tool when I wasn't using it and watched me work through the frames, the way you watch a person do a thing they know how to do, with a particular attention that is also a kind of respect. When I put the last cover back on, he said, "They look good, Dad." I said, "They do." We walked back to the house and I made breakfast and we ate it without the kitchen feeling like something I was enduring. When he left that afternoon, he said he'd call the following week. He did. I still go out to the hive yard in the early mornings. I go in all weather, which is not new, but I notice more than I used to, I notice when the expected sounds are absent, the absence of birdsong in a particular stand of cedar. A stillness that is not the stillness of nothing happening. I notice what Mac notices, which has turned out to be a reliable instrument. I find, sometimes in November and sometimes in February, that the bases of my hives have been worked overnight in ways that supplement what I've done. The wind gaps sealed, the pine duff freshened, the snow packed firm in arcs around each base. I don't go looking for an explanation anymore. I filled the dish on the cedar stump last week. Good comb, late harvest, the kind that holds its colour through the winter. I set it at the base of the old tree the way Della used to set it. Not ceremonially, just carefully, the way you put a thing in a place where it belongs. Mac came with me, sat at my feet while I straightened up and looked out at the tree line. The cedars dark against a sky that was going pale at the edge. We stood there for a minute, the two of us. I don't know what it was. I've stopped needing to know. What I know is that something in those hills was paying attention long before I understood I needed it to, and that the attention had a shape I recognized, the shape of someone quietly doing the work that keeps a fragile thing alive through the cold. The hives have come through every winter. Della would have found that satisfying. I find these days that I do too. Mac was at the porch step when I turned back to the house, waiting on me the way he always waits, patient and grey-muzzled and present. And the morning was coming in gold over the ridge, and the hives were alive behind me, all 14 of them, and the dish was on the cedar stump. That's all I can tell you. It's enough.